Today I found the top 10 worst Metroidvanias on Steam according to user reviews and decided it would be fun to spend 30 minutes of my life playing each one. In this video I'll be sharing my experiences with each of these games, starting with the best of the worst, Exodus, coming in at number 10 with 52% positive reviews on Steam. Exodus is the kind of game you'd see on a demo disc from the late 90s, take one glance at, never install, and forget about forever. But actually, Exodus released in 2013, just 1 year before Hollow Knight's Kickstarter. The trailer is 4 minutes and 16 seconds long. I watched as much as I physically could, opened it, and started a new game, and cried inside as the trailer played again, without any option to skip. This is the trailer? That's 4 minutes long? They just threw the trailer into the game. But I thought it's not so bad, we'll only have to sit through it a single time. Then, as soon as the intro ended, the game crashed. The game crashed! Dude, I spent so much time sitting through that trailer that the game just crashed. So I sat through the lore dump for a third time, and the game finally loaded. Our character crash lands on an alien planet and is contacted by the Prime Minister, who explains that the inhabitants of his city are trapped in a stasis pod to shield themselves from a planetary environmental cataclysm which has doomed them all. The Prime Minister doesn't seem too concerned about us, even though we just crash landed on a planet which evidently isn't the safest place to be. He simply tells us to hurry up and save his city, and so we set off to do just that. Exodus doesn't have controller support, even though it released in 2013, and the default movement controls use ZQSD instead of WASD. The movement in the game is slippery, and your character has little range with their melee attack. Enemies don't perform attacks of their own, they just run back and forth, dealing contact damage if you accidentally touch them. Performing attacks consumes stamina, which recovers slowly over time. To recover stamina quickly, you must retreat and sit. You have to stop what you're doing and sit to recover stamina to perform basic attacks. Oh, you have to sit here like a dumbass to recover your stamina. At one point, I saw a trail of collectible tokens leading off a cliff, so I jumped off, following the tokens as gamers have been trained to do for centuries, and I died from fall damage. When I respawned, the game provided a tutorial stating I had to return to the location I died at to collect my tokens, or I'd lose them for good. So I ran back to where I fell, and there was nothing there. I ran to the cliff I fell from, and there was also nothing there. My hard-earned Exodus tokens were lost forever. Nowhere to be found. One thing I loved about Exodus was it included title text for every room, only they weren't the most creative. The cavernous room was titled Caves, the meadow, Meadow, the clearing, Clearing. My favorite was Throny Tunnel, not to be confused with Thorny Tunnel. Anyway, I was about to find one of the 3 keys to unlock the city that I was never told the name of, yet was tasked with rescuing, but when I attempted to continue to the next room, the game crashed. So I tried to load the save, but the game crashed again. In the following 5 minutes, the game just repeatedly crashed, and I was unable to continue to the next area. And it dawned on me that Exodus was the highest reviewed game I was going to be playing today. Next is the 9th worst Metroidvania on Steam according to user reviews. Curse of the Sea Rats. Curse of the Sea Rats is a self-proclaimed ratoidvania with 48% positive reviews on Steam. In terms of artwork, animation, and voice acting, the production values are all there. But does the game hold up? No. In the game, you play as one of 4 prisoners aboard a boat heading to Great Britain where you're to be sentenced to death. One would assume the prisoners of this boat might have a rocky relationship with their captors. But when the boat is shipwrecked by a witch who kidnaps the Admiral's son and curses the seafarers to become rats, the Admiral turns to us, the prisoners, to save the day. Now, personally, if I were the Admiral of a ship and my son was kidnapped by a witch, the last people I'd send to save him would be the prisoners I was taking to be executed, and the game doesn't even justify it. I also found it interesting interesting just how unconcerned everyone was about being turned into rats. The only person who even mentioned it was the Admiral, and even then it was only in passing. Other crewmates are more concerned about asking you to find some black pepper for their food or a poker card that they lost than the fact that they were turned into rats. I set off and was promptly killed by a crab, because the default amount of damage dealt by anything in the game is 1/3 of your life, even if it's contact damage, and the only way to recover health is through consumables which are in short supply, or just by fucking dying, like I did. Eventually, I found the witch. She summoned a boss who charged me, knocking me back into the corner where I was immediately hit again and killed by contact damage, my favorite thing. But after returning, I discovered the boss would periodically just fall over and let you wail on him, so I just ran away until that happened, eventually winning the fight. Curse of the Sea Rats wasn't broken like Exodus, but that's the best thing I can say about it. The game lacks anything that could ever evoke feelings of joy or satisfaction, but it's about to get worse, because it's time to look at the 8th worst Metroidvania on Steam according to user reviews, Paradox Soul. Paradox Soul actually looked interesting, making me question why it only had 45% positive reviews on Steam. It's a minimalist pixel art Metroidvania set in a mysterious abandoned complex in Iceland 1987, filled with robots and the bodies of scientists. We find a gun and are suddenly chased by a killer robot that comes to life. I thought, dang, this is pretty neat. I'm excited to see what this game has to offer. But the plot twist is that I'd already experienced everything the game had to offer in the first 2 minutes, and we still had 28 minutes left to go. Paradox Soul is the most repetitive video game I've ever played. In it, there are 2 types of enemies. Enemies who run at you, which kill you instantly through contact damage, and ranged enemies who stand in place and periodically fire bullets, which kill you instantly. To deal with ranged enemies, you use the game's cover system. While behind cover, you have invincibility versus projectiles as long as you're not shooting. So you wait for the enemy to stop shooting, and then you shoot. And then you wait, and then you shoot, and then you wait, and then you shoot, until the enemies are dead, or until you die of boredom. I'm not sure if I've visited all the rooms in Paradox Soul. Maybe I did. They all looked the same because every room in Paradox Soul is a hallway. I would have liked, at least, to have been able to traverse vertically between the hallways. Instead, the game makes you use staircases to teleport to other hallways. So your experience of moving horizontally through hallways is never at any point interrupted. I'll credit them that at least they colored some of the hallways differently, but even the music is made up of the same 4 to 5 second loops on repeat over and over. The first boss went as expected. It floated above the room, spawning insta-kill melee ads, then fired a barrage of bullets from the side of the room, and just alternated those attacks over and over. Paradox Soul is functional, but there's just nothing enjoyable about it. It's only an hour long, but it's more like a 15-minute game stretched to an hour's length. I did enjoy the vibes, and to be fair, the game is priced appropriately at under $5. But how about we get to the 7th worst Metroidvania on Steam, according to user reviews, Yeomna, The Legend of Dongbaek. Yeomna is actually a Metrovania, according to the devs, so I can only assume it ended up at 43% positive reviews as a result of disappointed Metroid fans. Now, to start off, I don't particularly love when a game lore dumps you in the intro, but if it does, at least ensure the player has enough time to read the text before moving on. The game's artwork and style is actually interesting, but I was too busy desperately trying to read the subtitles before they disappeared to appreciate it. At last, the Jade Emperor and the allies of the defeated were sealed or fled into the darkness, and the worlds once again knew peace. Got it. We start off Yeomna in the midst of a raging inferno, the entire landscape engulfed with flames. The protagonist remarks that they find the fires strange, which might be the understatement of the year. I proceeded ahead and met the game's first boss, who stood stood in place and asserted dominance. After wailing on him for long enough, the boss finally reacted with a giant yell, and the screen went black. When I woke up, I was immediately sent to Lord Yeomna, who immediately sent me on a quest to find a lost child, to which I said, okay, as if I wasn't just knocked out by a giant demon, and off I went. In Yeomna, landing gunshots causes so much screen shake, it's like an earthquake each time a bullet lands. I picked up an ability called Cat Slash, which I was excited to try, but I couldn't ever figure out how to use it. There's weird puzzles around the map that I didn't understand, so I just hit every button prompt and apparently succeeded. Most of the enemies in the game are flying and don't have any collision. They fly through floors, walls, and ceilings to reach you, performing an instant attack once in range. If you thought primal aspids or crystal hunters were bad, you don't know bad flying enemies until you've played Yeomna. It wasn't long before I reached the boss of the level. Its AI loop was summoning a slime, then walking back and forth across the room. If you're in range while the boss walks, it'll perform a single melee attack on you. But the main issue was its health. You have to wail on the boss for minutes before it dies, and there's no feedback based on how much damage you've dealt. That same AI loop of walking across the room and back just continues on forever. My chat reminded me I was on hard mode, so the devs just buffed the hell out of its HP to make it hard without even testing how long the fight would last. I spent the rest of my time with the game trying to make a single jump and failing repeatedly, dying 4 times in the process, until chat told me maybe I should try jumping as the cat, and I made the jump immediately. By the way, you can turn into a cat in Yeomna, which is the game's main redeeming quality. But it's finally time to move on to the next game, the 6th worst Metroidvania on Steam according to user reviews, Dark Matter. When I opened the Steam page for Dark Matter, I was greeted by another PowerPoint trailer several minutes in length. At this point, I was already so exhausted playing these games I could hardly see straight, let alone listen to another lore dump. So I opened the gameplay trailer instead, where they boasted about the game's real-time lighting system, its resource collecting and crafting system, and its puzzles using interactable background objects. Now, these systems might have been revolutionary for a Super Nintendo game, but just like Exodus, Dark Matter released in 2013. And even though these systems were basic back then, they unfortunately still weren't executed effectively. Hence the game's 40% positive review score on Steam. When I launched the game, Dark Matter, oddly enough, opened up in between my 2 monitors, opening up half on one monitor and half on the other. Okay, this is jank as fuck already. After troubleshooting, I entered the game's tutorial and quickly learned that using background objects to solve puzzles really meant just clicking on every interactable object I could see to open the gate to the next area. But thankfully, you could reach those gates faster because in Dark Matter, your running jump gives you a speed boost like your Mario. This was unironically the best part of the game. Dark Matter plays like a point-and-click adventure game with none of the elements which make the genre enjoyable, but all of the aimless meandering and searching for things on screen to click. Dark Matter is all hallways, just like Paradox Soul, but replace the staircases which teleport you with ladders. Combat involves walking backwards while spamming left-click on enemies. Your character doesn't have a dodge, so the only way to avoid damage is by max ranging everything. It doesn't help that enemies are bullet sponges, sometimes requiring multiple reloads just to down a single basic enemy. Now, even though Dark Matter supports higher resolutions, the UI doesn't scale with them. As I played the game, I was confused when sometimes the controls would just stop working. But eventually I realized there was a stamina system in the game. The bar representing your stamina is the tiny square underneath your health. The text in the game isn't really much better. A lot of it is borderline unreadable just because of the size. Eventually, I reached a point with a dead end, so I turned around and backtracked through the entire map, searching for new hallways to explore. I returned as my 30 minutes with Dark Matter ended, pondering what I could have possibly missed, shooting at the floor and ceiling out of boredom, when suddenly the door to the next area opened. I don't know. Why did it open? What was it that I missed? I missed a tiny flare on the ground that I had to left click and shoot to open the gate. I don't know why a flare opened it, but I'm not about to waste another brain cell on dark matter, because we're about to play the 5th worst Metroidvania on Steam according to user reviews, Humanity Asset. At first, I had trouble getting Humanity Asset to run. I opened the game and received an error which said present fail title, and the game crashed. But even though Humanity Asset received only 38% positive reviews on Steam, I was excited to give it a shot. After a bit of troubleshooting, I started a new game and was greeted by this. Anyone else seeing this frame rate? Now, I like to think I have a powerful PC, but it's evidently not powerful enough for Humanity Asset. So I had to play the game with a bit of slowdown and input delay, but that's not going to stop me from enjoying it. Humanity Asset starts off on a spaceship. At least I think it's a spaceship. It's tricky to piece together much about the setting because all NPC dialogue is random one-liners they spit out as you walk past them. I was able to figure out there was some kind of war taking place, so I left the spaceship and began killing everything in sight. Combat in Humanity Asset is simple. Hold forward and click on enemies until they die. Dodging is not a feature in Humanity Asset because dodging projectiles is for wusses. In Humanity Asset, you take every damage that gets directed to you, and it doesn't even matter because your health regenerates instantly. Metroidvanias typically leave collectibles and unlockable abilities at the end of branching paths. Humanity Asset has numerous optional pathways, each of which contain nothing at the end of them. The game is just full of dead ends. But you don't really need upgrades anyway because you start off the game invincible. There are guns you can pick up throughout the map, but they weren't much different and require you to drop the gun you have currently equipped. Eventually I reached a mini-boss, which I killed by spamming left click, and it dropped a weapon that was too heavy for me to use, so I left it behind and backtracked to find another path. All the enemies in previous rooms respawned, so I had to clear them a second time. I eventually found a new doorway above the mini-boss and noticed a spot that I could slide into and roll through, thinking the game was inviting me to enter. But after I did, I was sent off a cliff back into the room with the mini-boss. It took 3 minutes of walking to get back to the point I was at. It was then that I realized I'd been listening to the same in-game music on repeat for 20 minutes straight. The music is the best part of the game. I don't even know if the music has changed this whole time. It was awesome. I can't wait to finish the game on my own time. Hopefully it doesn't melt my Steam Deck. Next up, we have the 4th worst Metroidvania on Steam, according to user reviews, Nihilsearch. At first, I wasn't sure what to think about Nihilsearch. The developer states it's a pixel windscreen 2D action-adventure game. The art style wasn't my favorite. In the game, each area has its own color, but the gimmick isn't executed quite as well as in Greece. The trailer, however, had some bangin' orchestral epic music, which I enjoyed, even if the developer definitely didn't make it. Either way, I was excited that the game at least wasn't a slideshow, even if it only had 36% positive reviews on Steam. So I opened it, and my antivirus had something to say about that. Suspicious file detected. Wait a minute. But it was a false alarm, I think. Continuing on and praying the game didn't turn my computer into a Bitcoin mining operation, I clicked Start Game. Our protagonist awakens saying only, "I'll find it, promise you," and we set off, not knowing exactly what our protagonist intends to find. Inspecting in-game objects oddly provides commentary from a character named Dad. I wasn't sure if Dad was a figment of my imagination until I noticed the smiley face appearing when he spoke. Dad wasn't the most eloquent speaker, but I loved Dad as a companion. He was my friend, and I was going to protect him. Really want to drink a latte. Although I can't drink at all. Ha ha ha. Nihilsearch begins on a street of vacant, empty buildings. There's a lot of walking, so I'm glad that I found I could yeet myself across the screen so quickly the camera couldn't keep up, just by hitting the dodge button. Eventually, I entered a building containing multiple rooms I could actually explore, and the game began. In Nihilsearch, anytime you land a strike on an enemy, it causes an explosion of fireworks. I eventually encountered a mini-boss I had to hit repeatedly, and I couldn't even see what was happening. Luckily, the enemy barely moved. I would have liked to have been able to heal after too, but the only way to heal in Nihilsearch is by f***ing dying. I found a new area called Residential Area, but died without finding a save point. I entered Building Complex and died there too. Navigating the map of Nihilsearch could have been more enjoyable with a healing ability, but Nihilsearch does have a pogo at least, and you can even pogo spikes, but you only gain a few pixels of height with each pogo, so it's not easy to use. I was proud after I managed to perform a pogo skip, but then immediately died again. And my time with Nihilsearch ended, which brings us to our top 3 worst Metroidvanias on Steam according to user reviews, starting with the 3rd worst, Inescapable. Inescapable was, in a way, a breath of fresh air after some of the games I just played. Not because it's good. Inescapable was just so lacking in ambition that it couldn't fail. It's the kind of game I'd imagine an AI might make if you asked it to make a Metroidvania. It ticks all the boxes of a Metroidvania, but misses the point. In practice, Inescapable is less like Metroid and more like Chip's Challenge, but if you took out the puzzles. Inescapable has 36% positive reviews on Steam. It's the 3rd lowest rated Metroidvania ever, according to user reviews. Inescapable begins with a crash landing on an alien planet, but the gameplay is like if someone followed a game maker tutorial to create unlockable gates and then spent months designing assets and building a world around that mechanic alone. My biggest problem with the game is false advertising. It's true that if you get soft locked behind a gate, as I once did, it's inescapable, but this is hardly a Metroidvania. This is Gate Simulator 2013. Inescapable is completely linear and has no music. For the most part, all you do is enter a room, find the gate, then run around like a dumbass until you find the key to the gate. You then continue forward until you find the next gate. I encountered one puzzle playing the game. There's a pressure plate on the floor which opened a gate containing an enemy holding a key to the room's gate. Beside the pressure plate is a gate, opened by a switch, behind which is a wandering husk. You have to open the gate to allow the wandering husk out, then close the gate so it's trapped and forced to walk on the pressure plate repeatedly, which opens the gate to fight the enemy and collect the key to the room's final gate. After opening it, you proceed through a linear sequence of rooms to discover a key to another gate. But that's enough talk about gates. It's time to move on to the 2nd worst reviewed Metroidvania on Steam, Red Goddess Inner World. If you took a bowl of dough and left it in the oven until it turned into a chunk of volcanic rock, you would have a better argument selling your charcoal as bread than Yanim Studio has selling Red Goddess Inner World as a finished game. Red Goddess Inner World is a Kickstarter game which also receives support from an independent investor. Yannick Puig was the game director and writer for Red Goddess, even though he had no credentials as either. He was an animator and Yanim Studio was an animation studio. Yet they marketed their game on their Kickstarter as the most ambitious 2D platformer of all time. They aimed to release on 6 different platforms, with talent trees, a Bastion-esque narrator, the polarity-switching mechanics of Outland, the character-swapping mechanics of Trine, the ability to enter and solve puzzles within the minds of your enemies, Ronald Jenkins writing the soundtrack, a hostile world that dynamically changes to slow your progress, and a delicately woven narrative about a young girl exploring her family trauma. But Red Goddess Inner World received just 35% positive reviews on Steam. As you play Red Goddess, a narrator endlessly talks over the gameplay without pause, describing every event, every scene in front of you, and how your character feels at every moment. The narrator speaks so much, the voice lines actually interrupt each other. The narrator cannot keep up with the pace of the game.
It was not a normal planet. It was a reflection of her. Once again, that voice that called her from the depths.
The audio wasn't even balanced, meaning the narrator was sometimes inaudible due to the volume of the music. which was actually preferable.
She closed her eyes.
Red Goddess's writing is plagued by a self-defeating heavy-handedness. There is no subtlety here. Throughout the game, a blue figure in our protagonist's likeness appears and provides helpful advice. The first thing this figure tells you is that the narrator shouldn't be trusted. Even the Steam store page describes the narrator as an enemy. The result is that the players just ignore everything the narrator has to say, all 100,000 of his voice lines. And if we're supposed to ignore the narrator, what's the point of it? What's the point of telling the player the narrator is evil outright, instead of allowing the player to figure it out for themselves? The gameplay wasn't any better. My experience playing Red Goddess was just opening the map to follow a marker to the next objective, and the combat was just mashing the attack button. I had a lot of miscellaneous issues with the game though, like the Super Mario 64 font, the subtitles being off-center, the map menu playing music which overlaps with the game's music instead of muting it. They're just overlapping. Interesting. And the map randomly opening when I changed screens. It felt like I had the map open half the time I was playing the game. But one of the worst problems was the constant use of these circular load zone structures which broke the pacing of the game. It forces you to sit inside and wait while the game loads. Why use these throughout the world instead of using regular screen transitions? Yeomna Studio intended to bring this game from pre-alpha when the Kickstarter released to finished within just 10 months. On the Kickstarter, Yannick Puig called his team a game studio, even though they'd never developed a game before. If a teacher decides his 6th grade computer class should become a sweatshop developing the next Star Citizen, that doesn't make his class a game studio until they've actually worked on a game. I could make an entire video about what a mess Red Goddess was, but forget about that. Let's talk about the lowest rated Metroidvania on Steam, according to user reviews. Micetopia. Micetopia only has 14 reviews, a whopping 11 of which are negative, which puts it at 22% positive reviews. But while other games, in my opinion, deserved their ratings, Micetopia actually wasn't that bad. I wouldn't give it a positive review, but I think Micetopia deserves better than 22%. It's cute, it's simple, it doesn't have a narrator babbling in your ear the entire time. Maybe I'm just coping from the trauma of playing these games for 7 hours straight, but Micetopia might be the best game in the entire top 10. Micetopia has a nice aesthetic, and I don't just mean compared to the other games I played today. It's genuinely pretty good. The town you start in has beautiful pixel art, especially the sprawling, multi-layered background, which really gives the illusion of depth. The game makes good use of colors. In the caves, there's the brown cavern walls, green vines, red mushrooms, yellow lanterns, and pink crystals, and it all works together well. There are some small touches too that give the game a bit more life, like the game's particle effects and how the lanterns sway as you bump into them. In terms of gameplay, Micetopia is straightforward. All the mice in town were taken into the caves and we have to save them. As you find mice in the caves, they teleport off into town and offer you an item or ability next time you visit. Combat in Micetopia, however, isn't great. It has the combination of a very short-ranged melee attack against enemies whose *1 threat is contact damage, which is something we've seen a lot of today. It doesn't help that your HP is limited to 3 and your only options to restore it are to f***ing die, which we've also seen a lot of, or to collect hearts by breaking pots and repeatedly re-entering the screen to farm them. But the core problem of Micetopia is much like Paradox Soul. It's just too repetitive. There's a real lack of incentive to actually defeat enemies, so you quickly realize that avoiding combat is the way to go. The level design is honestly also just boring. There's not enough space for movement. This is a limitation in the game design since all enemies are essentially Goombas dealing contact damage, and the level design has to use corridors funneling you into them for them to ever be a threat. Although artistically the levels look nice, there's almost no variety. The map is enormous, but it's pretty much the exact same rooms over and over. That said, after the exhausting grind of all the previous games I'd played, Micetopia was a breath of fresh air. It's just a simple game about exploring some caves, and I like that. And that's it. I survived the 10-game, 7-hour gauntlet of Steam's worst Metroidvanias, according to user reviews. In conclusion, I want to say that it's okay for bad games to exist, even unfinished ones, but some of these games tiptoed the line where I'd say maybe they don't belong on a digital marketplace for sale. Steam user reviews aren't a perfect metric to determine a game's quality, but from what we've seen today, I'd say it's mostly a pretty good one. But maybe we have some viewers today that will one day become Humanity Asset fanatics. Maybe I'm a Humanity Asset fanatic. Maybe Humanity Asset will be the game that dethrones Hollow Knight as the new definitive Metroidvania experience. Either way, hope you enjoyed the video and that you have a wonderful day. Peace.